Autain, shareholder. In this webinar, we will focus on perspectives on prison education in Australia and in New Zealand, understanding the challenges and innovative practices surrounding prison education in the various countries, measuring their scope and highlighting the projects that have been developed enable us to enrich our thinking and feed our development vision for this sector of education. For this purpose, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Helen Farley, as Associate Professor in Criminal Justice, Director of Criminal Justice, President of the Australian Corrections Education Association in Christchurch, New Zealand, who will be presenting her research and work as President of the Australian Correction Education Association. We are also very pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Woodland, a senior lecturer in theatre at the Victorian College in the Art in Melbourne, Australia. She will talk about her work, including the landmark project, Listening the Country, an immersive sound work production with incarcerated Aboriginal women from the Torres Strait.
Originaire du détroit de Torres.
To lead this discussion, I'm pleased to
Para dirigir este debate, me complace presentar
our Development and Research Advisor. But before continuing, here are some important information. You can choose to select the language of your choice by pressing the button illustrated by a planet at the bottom of the screen. Also, throughout the presentation, you will be able to write your question using the question and answer section. Members of the chair team will direct the question to the panelists. And we also want to inform you that the recording of this event will be posted on the chair's website within 2 weeks. And we wish you all a good webinar. So Marc-André, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie. We'll start the webinar with the presentation of Professor Farley.
Kia ora. My name is Helen Farley, and I'm the Director of Criminal Justice at the University of Canterbury in Ōtautahi, Christchurch, New Zealand. And I'm also the President of the Australasian Corrections Education Association. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Australian and New Zealand perspectives on prison education. E ngā mana e ngā reo, none paimongo whakahi I Uropi aho, tai noa ki ngā puna korero e rere nei, mai uta ki tai. Nā reira ke ngā korero o te waipunamu, mātou e noho ana, ke ngā mongo, ke ngā awa, tēnā koutou, ko Helen Farley, tōko ingoa. So there I am just introducing myself in te reo Māori. I'm telling you that I'm not from New Zealand at all. I'm actually from the rivers and ridgelines of Europe, and now I live in the ancient land of Te Waipunamu, or the South Island of New Zealand. And this picture is of Te Waipapa, which means flat water, or Diamond Harbour in English, which is where I live. I also told you that I respect your ancestors and your rivers and your mountains and those who came before you. I also wanted to acknowledge that close to my home there are big bushfires burning at the moment, and recognising how difficult it must be for those people who are incarcerated and who have family and friends living in this area. They won't be getting news about this, and they must be worried for their loved ones. First of all, I wanted to give you a little bit of context about Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. In Australia, there are 8 states and territories, and each one of those is a separate correctional jurisdiction. So basically, Australia has 8 correctional jurisdictions, and each one does things differently. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's just one correctional jurisdiction, so it makes things much easier. I can tell you that as of this week, there are 9,115 people in prison in New Zealand, which is an incarceration rate of about 170 per 100,000 people. And I can tell you that this week in Australia, there are 41,929 people in prison with an incarceration rate of 202 people for 100,000. And that is way above the average for the OECD of around 147 people per 100,000. So we find in both Australia and New Zealand that there are significantly longer sentence lengths than for other OECD countries and a greater rate of incarceration. So we can't really talk about education in prisons in Australasia without thinking about the particular cohort who we have in those prisons. In Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up about 3% of the population, but make up about 30% of the prison population, making them the most incarcerated people on the planet. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Māori make up 17% of the population and some 54% of the prison population. Again, a staggering amount of overrepresentation. And it makes me remember what previous research has shown. It's in those liberal democracies who you would expect to do better, where overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples is worse. We're also talking about a prison population where 50% have dyslexia, and this is fairly standard around the world. Around 66% of those people have no qualifications as compared to about 23% in the outside world. We expect that between 40 and 50% have ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and 91% have a lifetime mental health diagnosis. So we're talking about multiple layers of disadvantage. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, people in prison are actually screened for neurodiversities, particularly dyslexia. In Australia, it's pretty hit and miss. In Queensland, I know that neurodiversities are screened for. We know that a lot of the people in our prisons have post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think is an absurd thing to say when prison is so traumatising in itself. So to say that it's post-traumatic seems silly. It's happening right now. The other thing we often fail to recognise is that many of the people who work in prison are also traumatised and carry trauma. So they either come to the job with trauma, attracted to working in corrections because of their own experiences, often as victims in the criminal justice system, or they may acquire the trauma while they are incarcerated. And I think this leads to a lot of the high turnover that we see in corrections staff. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we keep staff about 1 year and 9 months before they leave their jobs. So finally, let's talk about prison education. And I'm going to make some sweeping generalisations for around prison education in Australia and New Zealand. First of all, I'm going to say that in concert with a lot of other jurisdictions around the world, that literacy and numeracy is favoured over all else. Certainly, the provision of that is by Te Wānanga or Aotearoa, which is a Māori university who have been awarded the tender to deliver that education in New Zealand. In New Zealand, we find that about 62% of our people in prison are literate, which is much different to what we thought it was. Perhaps 10 years ago, we thought that perhaps 66% were illiterate. Now that figure is reversed. I can't say across Australia, except that it differs greatly between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison and white people in prison. That amongst the Indigenous population, levels of literacy and numeracy are likely lower. The other thing I can tell you about Australia and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is that the further north you go in Australia, the higher the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that prison. So, say for example, in the northern Queensland prisons, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population might make up 60 to 70% of the population in that prison. Again, another sweeping generalisation, because there are exceptions, that lower level vocational education qualifications are delivered. And when I'm saying lower level, I'm meaning levels 1 and level 2. Now, there are a few reasons why this is. One of them is that people believe that the people in prison aren't capable of doing higher levels of education. And also because it's so difficult for prisons to get technology behind the wire, they sometimes don't have the equipment they need and the technology they need to be credibly delivering higher levels of qualification. And this is particularly true with things like construction and building and those sorts of things, where technology plays an even greater role than it has in the past. With these lower level qualifications, we often see people doing multiple, say level 2 qualifications in different fields, leading to something that we call qualification stacking, which looks terrible on a CV, but also doesn't advance the cognitive skills of the learner. I can say almost universally, vocational education is preferenced over academic education, even though many people in prison would like the opportunity to pursue academic education. Vocational education is preferenced because people assume that it better prepares people for employment. Research shows that this isn't the case, that both academic and vocational education both prepare people for employment to the same degree, and people are likely to be employed irrespective of what type of education they have. What is more important is the level of education, and if people get higher levels of education, they're more likely to be employed. While we're talking about employment, I should also say that there's this belief that people get out of prison and then find employment because of the qualifications they've received while incarcerated. The reality is that prison education doesn't get to that many people because of programming, psychological programming or criminogenic programming, or because of court appearances, or because of security classifications, or for any of those sorts of things. And I estimate that prison education gets to about 1 in 10 people across Australasia. The other thing to note is that only about 10 to 15% of people are employed on release from prison, and after 1 year this number is even lower. So I would argue that perhaps we need to think about preparing people for law-abiding unemployment, not just employment. But that's a whole other hobby horse of mine, and I won't take that up today. The other thing to note is that we have a lot of gender-based programming. So this picture here is of a hairdressing qualification being delivered at Christchurch Women's Prison. Now, hairdressing, at least in New Zealand, is a very poorly paid, oversubscribed industry. And so are we just setting people up to fail when we keep teaching them these sorts of things instead of, say, construction or higher education or something else. And also, sewing is a very common thing offered to women in prisons in Australia and New Zealand. So across Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, there are lots of different models of delivery. So in New Zealand, there are two parallel pathways almost. We have education tutors who facilitate academic education and literacy and numeracy, and that role is mostly an administrative function. And then we have industry instructors, and industry instructors are hands-on with the people in prison, teaching them skills, often in concert with a external provider. So for example, in New Zealand, we have BCITO who teach construction qualifications. Our industry instructors within the prisons actually work with the people in prison to teach them the skills and help them with that. And they're called assessors. They actually assess the competencies of those people in prison, and then the BCITO will award that qualification. In Australia, there's a range of different models. So in some jurisdictions, there are education tutors and industry instructors who are delivering qualifications, and in other jurisdictions, external providers will come into the prison and do the delivery themselves. So there's a wide range of delivery models. Another one that you also see in Australia is that the external educational institution might actually have a campus within the prison, and this happens in Victoria, for example. And as I mentioned before, there's a focus on literacy and numeracy, foundation skills, which is kind of the next level up. Because of the Indigenous overrepresentation in both countries, there's lots of cultural programs. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there will be Te Reo Māori and also Tikanga Māori. So tikanga is kind of the way of doing things, the Māori way of doing things, and looking at things from a Te Ao Māori worldview. So there are lots of those. There are lots of vocational short courses, and I don't want to be unkind, but lots of prisons deliver vocational short courses when they have a lot of budget to spend in a hurry. And by vocational short courses, I mean things like first aid courses, forklift courses, and so on and so forth. There are certificates in vocational education. These are the ones I've talked about before. There are industries based in the prisons in things like forestry, in beekeeping, in construction, in engineering, in carpentry, and so on and so forth. Obviously in laundry, so the essential industries, which are laundry, grounds, and also cooking. They're the essential industries within prisons, within New Zealand anyway. And there is, to some extent, higher education. So in New Zealand, higher education is delivered by Massey University. There are about 40 students across the country, so a very, very low percentage. And they can do just a grab bag of courses that are made available to them by lecturers and academics who feel inclined to do so. These courses don't actually ever come together to form a program. In Australia, the main supplier of higher education is the University of Southern Queensland, where I used to work. In Queensland, there are about 6.2% of people in prison engaged in higher education. The average for Australia is around 1.5%. Curtin University in Western Australia is another university that is very active in delivering higher education into prisons. In common with a lot of jurisdictions around the world, there's not much technology in prisons in Australia or in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So in New Zealand, there are computer labs or secure online learning labs. They have 10 or 12 thin clients attached to a server, and students come once or twice a week to those labs. There is limited internet to provide access to around 32 websites, mostly around literacy and numeracy, but also around driver's licensing. In Australia, most jurisdictions also have computer labs, to some with or without internet. In New South Wales, they also have tablet computers supplied by formerly GTL and now Viapath. In Western Australia, computers are supplied by Curtin University, and through the University of Southern Queensland, laptops are provided to those students studying higher education. So it's a bit hit and miss. I should also say that in the Australian Capital Territory, they have desktop computers in their cells, running Linux for emailing and studying and those sorts of things. But certainly they don't have untethered access to the internet. So I've recorded here why access to technology is so important. And the main reason is that people, to successfully reintegrate into society upon release, need to know how to use technology. There is no aspect of their lives that won't require them use technology, whether it's work or study or in their personal lives. Have you ever thought about going a day without technology? It would be impossible. So improving digital literacies, it's around creating better quality learning experiences, helping to address some of the learning challenges and neurodiversities I talked about earlier, allowing for study that happens beyond the classroom, so when people go back to their cells at the end of the day. And increasingly, providers are online, and as they move online, people in prison are losing the ability to access them. So now, just quickly talk about a few little projects that have caught my eye in Australia and New Zealand. So this one is actually one that's happening in New Zealand. It happened at Otago Corrections Facility, where the literacy and numeracy was provided by another provider, Methodist Mission. So what happened is that ruggedized tablets with no connection to the internet were preloaded with learning materials around teaching people how to do graphic design. Methodist Mission had partnered with a Maori provider called Maui Studios, who create lots of graphic novels and video and those sorts of things. And Maui Studios designed the animations and the learning, and then they worked with learners to contribute to existing projects. Many of the stories were Maori stories and were in Te Reo Maori, which of course is perfect for the majority Maori prison population in Aotearoa. You can see some of the lessons that the learners were involved with. They learned how to do things like colouring, drawing, and so on, and on release from custody they were given the opportunity to go and work for Maui Studios or for someone else within the graphic design domain. So it was a really great project. Again, this one happened at Otago Corrections Facility with Methodist Mission, and this time it was around virtual reality for literacy and numeracy. A virtual mechanics workshop was created with lots of nice cars, lots of Mercedes and BMWs and so on, and learners using VR goggles and using VR pointers interacted in the mechanics workshop, learning about cars and how they worked, but learning about literacy and numeracy along the way as well. And it was interesting because when you talk to those learners after the sessions, they said that it was really easy and that they really didn't learn anything and that it wasn't worthwhile from a learning point of view. They really enjoyed themselves in the workshop. But when we tested them pre and post, the gains were significant. Certainly they improved in both numeracy and literacy. So that was awesome. I'm also going to talk about a project called Making the Connection, which was a project I led when I was living in Australia and at the University of Southern Queensland. This project was about taking technology into prisons to provide access to higher education. There were two technologies, a server-based solution that went into computer labs and a notebook computer solution. And we knew that the computer lab solution would not be long-lasting because it's just too difficult to get people to a computer lab. You can't have people with different security classifications meeting on the walkway and so on and so forth. So we focused on the notebook computer solution. We created some software called Device Manager software that maintained the security of the device and also allowed learning to be allocated to students. Now, these computers were working completely without internet access. We had to deal with the lowest common denominator because we didn't want to have a different technology solution for each different jurisdiction in Australia. We also installed LibreOffice, which is a free version of Office, onto those computers, and also higher education courses. We had a very restricted higher education offerings. We wanted to make it so that people in prison could do a few courses that interested them that fitted into a Bachelor of General Studies degree. And then once they were released from custody, they could use those courses against a program of their own choosing. But if they stayed in prison long enough, they would be able to complete a whole degree. That also was possible. So initially it was deployed in Queensland, Tasmania, Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Now it's also been deployed in South Australia and New South Wales as well. And that project worked really well. So this is a diagrammatic overview of the project. You can see we had offline courses, an offline study desk kiosk which education officers could access to download the courses to put onto the personal computers. And then we had the enterprise platform, which was the service solution, or the student notebooks. And that was the overview. What we did find is that incarcerated learners actually did better than their non-incarcerated peers and had much better retention rates as well. So it was a really successful project. So it transitioned from being a project into being business as usual at the University of Southern Queensland, where they still use this model for delivery of courses into prisons. They have around 500 course enrolments each semester, 3 semesters a year, which is just fantastic. And now the project has been going long enough that we're seeing people come out of prison and actually turn up to the Uni SQ campuses to continue their study. So that's been really successful. I feel there's been lots to say and lots that I've left out, but I have to stop somewhere. But hopefully that's piqued your interest and we've scratched the surface. I just want to remind you about the Australasian Corrections Education Association Conference, which is an online conference being held between June 11 and 13. And please go to that website and consider submitting a paper. Very happy to answer any questions or make any comments or anything like that. Please get in touch with me via my contact details on the screen. Thank you. Ngā mihi nui.
I'm leaving now the parole to Sarah Woodland, so you can join us, and she'll be presenting.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much, Helen. I've never seen anyone be so unruffled with technical issues. It's an inspiration. I'm just going to share my screen, and I'm sharing sound as well. Which, oops, no, I don't want to share that, do I? Hang on, sorry.
Okay.
Go full screen.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, great. And we'll go back to the start. Thank you so much. So I'd just like to firstly acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the unceded lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, which is here in the south of Melbourne, Australia. And I'll acknowledge elders past and present, and the fact that matters of healing and education and knowledge sharing have been occurring on these lands for millennia before this moment. So yeah, I'm going to talk about two prison arts projects that I've been involved in recently here in Australia and in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the focus of this webinar is on prisoner education. While these projects did not strictly make their way into the prisons via the education programs, you'll see that they form part of a wider, holistic First Nations informed approach to programming that includes education within its scope. I'm an arts scholar. My specialist area is prison arts and community-based arts, and particularly theatre and performance. And I worked with colleagues to establish these projects in response to the over-incarceration of First Nations peoples in both countries that Helen referred to, and the limited programming that's tailored for those men and women, or even designed by or with them. They had three key elements in common that I hope will be of interest here. So both projects involved making cultural connection and cultural rights central through aligning and collaborating with the cultural strategies and programs of the correction systems here and in Aotearoa. And they were co-designed with cultural leaders both in the institution and in the community. They were also underpinned by holistic notions of well-being that encompass individuals and communities, education, health, culture, spirituality. They were multi-partner, cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary approaches that we hope added value to the work already happening in the institutions and communities. So the first project, Listening to Country. And no, it's not about listening to country music. Country is a term that's used by First Australians to look, I feel uncomfortable explaining this because I'm not First Nations myself, but it's a term to denote the connection to place and belonging. It's about the actual landscape environments themselves, but also the spiritual connection, the deep spiritual connection with those places, and the power that exists between all of the different elements of those systems, including the human beings. Listening to Country is an ongoing interdisciplinary research collaboration that explores the value of acoustic ecology and soundscape in promoting cultural connection, maintenance and well-being among First Nations peoples in communities and institutions. So this began with a pilot, but it's actually an ongoing collaboration. And my role in it, I'm very interested in how the elements of acoustic ecology and soundscape can promote these, promote cultural connection in institutions, not only like prisons, but hospitals, residential care facilities and other places where First Nations peoples find themselves off country, i.e. off their own, disconnected from their own place. So for those of us who don't know what acoustic ecology is, I'm relatively new to it, but it's an interdisciplinary field that investigates the connection between the health of environments and the health of people and how those interact with each other. And it's how that relationship between people and the environment is mediated through sound. And my wonderful colleague, Dr. Leah Barclay, who worked on Listening to Country, introduced us to that term and her practice and research in this space. So we did a pilot project that was funded by the Lowitja Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research in 2018. And this saw our team working with First Nations women in Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre to produce a 1-hour immersive audio work that was based on field recordings of natural environments or of country for the purpose of stress relief and relaxation. The Brisbane Council of Elders, who conduct weekly visits in southeast Queensland prisons, also supported the project. And a key partner was Queensland Corrections Murray-Dargan Cultural Unit, led by Dr. Claire Walker, which is responsible for training Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and coordinating cultural programs and policies across the department. So we worked with the women over a few weeks through this pilot, and it was an interdisciplinary arts approach that involved drawing, poetry, making sounds within the prison, but then also a process of yarning, which is a cultural process of talking or discussion that deepens the connection to each other and to the ideas of, in our case, belonging and country. And through that yarning process, we worked with women to identify particular sounds or places where they felt connected or a sense of belonging. And to the best of our ability, we went out and recorded those sounds and brought them back and worked with the women to create the soundscape. So I've got a bit of a sound clip to share with you. The women produced a particular soundscape that was for them, that is in a locked part of our website and was made accessible to them through their intranet. But then we also were given permission to share some of the ideas and do a re-edited version of it for the public. And that was Leah's work. Leah Barclay, the sound artist, has created this, which really is quite similar to the work that the women created. Now, it's going to perhaps not be fabulous sound quality on here. It's meant to be listened to with headphones, but let's have a go anyway, and you can get the sense of what it sounds like. So I won't keep that going because it really is a lot better if you're listening through headphones, and you can go to our Listening to Country website, listeningtocountry.com, and have a listen to the whole thing if you would like to. But you could hopefully hear in there that there's quite a lot of natural sounds, crickets and water and a fire, and it kind of builds and flows from then on into a dawn chorus and even underwater sounds as well. There's a part where the women produced a poem, and their voices are heard as well, but they're sort of filtered really heavily so that you can't recognise them. In Queensland, there are some really strict rules around, you know, privacy and confidentiality. So the soundscape itself was, as I say, created with the women, but then also they were engaging in a process of deep listening to the different sounds that we brought in, and then to the final product. And so we had a process evaluation of the project conducted by law scholar Professor Eleanor Marchetti from Griffith University. And she found that by working intensively through soundscape and yarning, the Listening to Country pilot reduced feelings of stress, created relaxation and connection for the women who participated. And it also was found to add value to the important cultural work that the elders and the Murray-Dargan Centre were already doing, strengthening the cultural rights of the women at Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre and facilitating connections to the elders and the community through creative practice. And where the project is now is that, you know, we're trying to build capacity for other people to use these approaches through developing a series of masterclasses. We've already done some work with Corrections New South Wales to support one of their parenting programs, Deadly Dads, which I think they use that tablet technology to enable fathers in prison to connect to their families, and they use a lot of drone footage and testimonies from elders and stories from elders that are then brought back into this prison for the men to watch on their tablets. So we've been working with them to think through how we can deepen that experience through being quite intentional around sound design and soundscape, and also working with the men to facilitate some kind of connection through sound. Okay, so then the second project was Nā Pātu Kōrero, or Walls That Talk, and this was a documentary theatre production that was staged in 2019 by incarcerated men at Auckland Prison in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to an audience of peers, staff and outside visitors. The play was directed by Rand Hazu from Massey University. He's a theatre scholar and maker there. And it was devised from verbatim responses to interviews conducted with men in Unit 8 to Purity, which is a specialist therapy unit for those convicted of sex offences. At the instigation of the men, the play was structured around Te Whare Tapawha, or the House of Four Sides, which is a holistic Māori model of health that was part of the therapeutic program at Te Purity. So the model, developed by Sir Mason Dury in 1994, uses the metaphor of the wharenui, or the meeting house, with four walls or sides. So we have taha tinana, which is physical health, taha wairua, spiritual health, taha hinegaro, which is mental health, and taha whānau, which is social health, all of which contribute to the structural integrity. These four sides contribute to the structural integrity of the house. In the performance, the actors progressively staged the physical construction of the different sides of this metaphorical house, each of which focused on an aspect of health and the different ways it was impacted by incarceration. So yeah, and the incorporation of Te Whare Tapawha was an attempt to centre Māori knowledge within the creative process and decision making. Ngā Pātū Kōrero offered an opportunity for audiences to hear the personal stories of incarcerated people in a communal experience, and this highlighted the importance of the relational in restoring balance and achieving healing and cultural justice. And that project, my involvement in that was to work with the men to create a podcast episode which followed the creation of the play. And Rand and I are now exploring ideas about how we can work with the story through listening. Rand has taken the script that was created in Te Piriti and a group of actors from the Hobson Street Theatre Company in Auckland, which is a theatre company for people experiencing homelessness. A group of actors have read that play in an audio production, and we're just exploring different ways with how we can engage with community through that listening process. And that's a real theme for my work, is that through line between the institution and the community, and the importance of maintaining those connections for people who are inside. So projects like these that build on foundations of cultural programs in prisons can help promote holistic, relational and communal understandings of education, healing and rehabilitation within and beyond prison walls. And I would also like to echo Helen's thought about how valuable partnerships with universities can be, where we can mobilise the talent and resources to undertake this kind of non-traditional research and practice that involves co-designing, co-creating and delivering innovative arts education programs while also measuring their impacts. And I might just finish there, I think, Camille. I'm happy to open for questions.
Yeah, thank you. Marc-André is gonna take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Helen, for your presentation. Quite interesting and a bit of a fresh air here in North America. It's a bit different and it's quite challenging for us. So we have a couple of questions. So I will address. You can open your camera, Helen, if you want to join or discuss with us some question that we have for you today. Well, first of all, I would like to know a little bit about the fact that you've been organizing, Helen, some courses, numeric courses or distance courses with computers and technology. Do you consider in the indigenous community or Maori community, do you think it's achieving a pedagogical goal as a teaching in prisons? Is there a difference? Do you observe some difference between the result on online education and something like in prison courses?
Oh, that's a really good question. When we design those distance courses, a particular aspect of the funding was that we particularly focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison. What we found, we found a couple of things. First of all, we found that a lot of people who were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander didn't identify as such, because they associated a stigma with that identity. And so even though they were Indigenous, they didn't identify as such. So we encourage them to identify, but obviously that's something we don't have a lot of influence over. The other thing that we really realised is that Indigenous pedagogies, and this goes for Māori and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners, are very learner-centric and very reciprocal. And to approach education in that way is not just better for Indigenous people, it's better for everyone. Everyone learns better in that way. And so we try to, as much as possible, present our materials in a learner-centric way. Now, that was tricky because we couldn't have discussion forums and group work and all of those things that you see in student-centered learning. But we did try and, imitate that. So we did try and make that, we did try and give the illusion of doing that. Try to create the feeling of community, try to create that feeling of support, even if we couldn't actually achieve it. Now, I think we were very successful in that because we ended up with people very firmly cleaving to the university. They really identified with the university. They consider themselves part of the learning community. And one of the first things that they would do when they were released from custody would be to turn up at the university at the front desk. Even though we were a distance learning university, they still did that. They identified very strongly with that university. For some of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners, and we heard about this earlier, that country is a very important idea, and being connected to country. So also a lot of our learners who are very distant to us, so we had a lot of learners in Western Australia, for example, then transferred their studies to Curtin University, which is a local university in Western Australia, and for some people that works better for them. Pre-tertiary stuff, so those courses that led into higher education, we had some specialist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander courses there, which were very popular. And again, now Curtin University is doing that. So I don't feel that the University of Southern Queensland needs to do those courses. I'm just happy if someone does those courses and caters for those Indigenous students. Certainly, because the prison population in Aotearoa and New Zealand are mostly Māori, we very much have a focus on Māori perspectives and Mataranga Māori learning. So Māori ways of learning are certainly a lot more prominent here. So yeah, definitely. I hope I answered that.
Yeah. You talk also about the fact that they're overrepresented in the carceral system over there, but notwithstanding the fact that there are a few number of students in those kind of programs. So you managed to merge a little bit, like coming together with a lot of university. How did you find out that it was quite difficult to do this kind of federalism of universities,
Yes.
because they're in competition sometimes? So it's quite a challenge, I think. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's quite nice here. There is more of a sense of philanthropy here, and more of a sense of social justice than perhaps in Australia, and maybe in some other countries as well. So certainly, and really we relied on people who were interested in doing it. So we approached people who we knew were in favour of it, who were already teaching courses that were into prisons or interested in doing that or researching in that area. So we brought like-minded people together and appealed on a social justice basis, and that seems to have worked. There are always people, of course, we call them the bean counters, Marc-Andre, who want the money to be sorted, but there is no money in here. There are so few learners and the prison population is too small that it will never be financially viable to do it. We have to do it because it's the right thing to do. In Australia, it's different. There are more people, and the universities are making money from incarcerated people. That's not the case here in New Zealand. There's not enough people to make any money from it, and so we have to appeal to everyone's better side to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Sarah. You talk about the holistic approach with First Australian in prison. Do you see a united approach, notwithstanding the fact that there is a diversity among First Australian? So do you think it's a sort of standardization of the way to create some programs precisely for the First Australians? Is there like a contradiction between the fact that this holistic approach is like a wall-to-wall approach, or is it considering the fact that the First Nations are probably a little bit different on those kind of values or principles?
Yeah, look, I mean, there is a tension there because we have over 400 different language groups or nations within what is now called Australia. So that you make a very good point, Mark, about the fact that there is no sort of generic Indigenous or First Nations worldview in this country or these countries. But there are scholars, first Indigenous scholars, who have worked hard to, I guess, create models that are reflective of a kind of collective view. And I mean, I always feel a little uncomfortable white-splaining this kind of stuff, but from my perspective, it seems like there's a certain amount of pragmatism in that project for those scholars, where it's about how can we speak to the mainstream Western system in a way that they understand, in ways that will support our people in these systems. So to that end, I think there's been a lot of work done in creating these models that are sort of not, that they're open enough to accommodate the worldviews of a whole sort of spectrum of different First Nations cultures. And they're almost always, you know, they almost always have those same elements that I mentioned about the Maori model, Te Whare Tapawha, which is about those different domains of well-being. There's one here called the Growth and Empowerment Measure, that is a sort of psychological screening tool that has been developed here by First Nations health practitioners, which has a similar focus of these different domains: connection to country, connection to family and community, connection to body, you know, so different aspects. And actually reflecting what Helen said earlier about First Nations approaches to education, I think we could all benefit from viewing well-being through that lens, that holistic lens, and attending to all those different aspects of our well-being, and not forgetting, not having this individualistic notion, which is all about correcting people and, you know, individualized rehabilitation, but it's about how this sits within the broader context of our communities and our societies. But these models are gaining prominence, and it's great that they are. And particularly, as Helen said, in New Zealand, there's perhaps a bit more openness and intentionality around that for a whole heap of reasons that I won't go into. But they are gaining prominence, and there is more attention towards First Nations ways of doing things, because we are learning here over and over again that the Western model just is not working in all kinds of domains, in justice, in health, in education, you know. So I'm not sure if I answered your question there, Mark, but yes,
you did.
There are some, okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. We have the same questioning here in developing projects for First Nation here in Canada. But I must learn from your experience. I think Australians and New Zealanders had this tradition more over time to adapt and develop programs for these particular population. That is quite remarkable, and we imported this kind of processes into Canada. But in Quebec here, we are a French-speaking province. We are a little bit off track in that time, so we have to compensate. I have another questions. I know that from your work, you've been working with John Dewey, pragmatic approach on education, and I would like to know in what way concepts like experience and continuity might have been a way to create this kind of innovative approach that you presented with sound and theater. In what way did the Deweyan mind of education, that is probably a Western thought, but I think it could be something that is relative pertinent for this kind of process. So I want you to speak a little bit about this kind of theoretical aspect of your work.
Sure. I mean, look, you were right in saying that Dewey is a white Western man, and so that's probably from my past, my PhD study and shortly afterwards. But actually, I do maintain a kind of love for particularly Dewey's aesthetic theory. So I haven't dug as deeply into his educational theory, although I'm kind of aware of it. But I was really interested in his aesthetic theory, which he articulated in Art as Experience. And I think, yeah, it infuses what I do, but, you know, in these types of projects, in a sense that, you know, the pragmatist aesthetic view is about living a good life and a life of value, and attending to your relations with others and your relation with your environment is an artistic or an aesthetic project. So I think there are really strong connections between Dewey's theory, and indeed he was influenced by Eastern philosophy. So there's no surprise that there's this sense of holism in his aesthetic theory. And I am very interested in particularly the experience of making, because we don't often attend to that with aesthetics. It's about how we view it, or watch a play, or, you know, what information we receive when we consume art. But I'm interested in how we engage, or how in this case the participants engage aesthetically in the making process as well. And Dewey talks about the interaction between the maker and the made, and how that's a kind of ongoing cycle that enhances us and elevates us. And so I'm interested in that. There's no way to measure it, obviously, but yeah, that's my connection to Dewey's theory. But I take a lot of care not to impose my sort of theoretical framing in these projects. I do a lot of listening to my First Nations colleagues and participants around the way that they want to frame things and articulate these projects.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let Julie just close a little bit the webinar for today. So if Julie want to address some final words for this, thank you.
For sure. I want to warmly thank our panelists. Your presentation gave us a relevant insight into the realities of your respective countries. And thank you all for your attendance. And of course, we invite you to visit our website and sign for our newsletter so you don't miss our next webinar, which will be on May 15 from 10 to 11:30 Canada Eastern Time. Then we will talk about masculinity, identity, and reinsertion, in prison. Again, thank you all so much for your presentation, and see you next time.